What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you gaming genres that I simply do not play anymore, for one reason or another, which I thought might make for an interesting video, because I play a lot of video games, if you'd believe it. But sometimes I think it's a little interesting to consider the games that I don't play, and why that is. In some cases, it might just simply be a matter of preference. I don't necessarily like the mechanics of a certain type of game, as an example, or in others, or at least one case anyway, they tend to make me a little violently ill. But whatever the case may be, all of these genres have, for one reason or another, been things that I've just kind of left by the wayside, as my own taste, preferences, and even time have changed over the years. But with all of that said, let's actually go ahead and just dive into this one. Kicking it off with one of the ones that I think is a little more interesting to talk about generally, because the situation around it is a little weird for me, which is none other than deck builders. You may very well notice that I don't cover a lot of games involving any sort of card mechanic, outside of things that are just straight up card games, which is where it gets interesting. You see, I don't enjoy deck builders. Something about trying to build a randomized deck of cards to usually facilitate some sort of ability on your end, often in the form of a roguelike even, is just the type of gameplay that doesn't sit well with me. It's why I'm not going to play things like Balatro, even though from basically everything I've heard, it's a fantastic game, and I'm sincerely glad a bunch of people are having fun with it. But I also have absolutely no desire to play that for myself. And yet, I think Balatro itself is actually also an interesting example of this, because I don't really have a problem with actual card games either. Things like Magic the Gathering, Gwent, Queen's Blood, and Rebirth, The Elder Scrolls Legends before that got cancelled, all well and good. And yet, when you start taking those card games and incorporating them into like other things, typically in service of trying to be like an RPG or something, that usually is where you lose me. One thing I actually really enjoy about card games is that they operate off a very sort of set in stone set of rules, like this thing does this thing, and you can sort of learn the ins and outs of that and the meta and everything. And yet oftentimes with deck builders, while there are elements of that, that's not really the core of it either, but rather a lot of the sort of random interactions that can occur tend to take precedence, and oftentimes the card interactions themselves tend to take place of things I would actually want to be doing. Like, for instance, they tend to stand in as a proxy for sort of fights in certain types of RPGs and the like, and I would rather just play a game that lets me do those fights, you know what I mean? And I guess if I were to get at the heart of why I don't enjoy deck builders in particular, pretty much is that. The fact that oftentimes the deck building tends to be a stand-in for what I would rather be doing when I'm playing those types of games. And I don't really feel that building a deck is a great stand-in for those experiences, which I think at least is why I prefer to play just regular old TCGs or even LCGs more recently as compared to an actual deck builder. Which is why, at the end of the day, 9 out of 10, if I see card mechanics and it's not surrounded by something else that's really cool, it's pretty much an immediate nope from me anymore. Which brings us to our second entry, and this is a little broad, but generally just multiplayer online games, MMORPGs. These are the type of game that I played a lot of back when I was a teenager. And if you've watched a lot of the channel and know much about my experience as a teenager, it's probably no surprise that what I tended to enjoy about these games is that they offered a way to kind of escape into a different reality where I could be somebody else for a time while still engaging with other people. And yet, just like my own life has moved on since then, truth be told, MMOs have as well. In fact, the reason I don't play MMOs anymore and really don't cover much of anything that has a specific multiplayer focus on the channel as an example is actually really, really simple. These days, MMOs are pretty much designed from the ground up to keep you playing as long as possible, basically forever if they could swing it, and that is just no longer a concept that appeals to me. In fact, if you watch the channel, you may notice that I have a big propensity to just finish things and move on. I like to kind of do everything there is to do and then be on my merry way to go have a different experience, and that is something that is kind of incompatible with modern day MMOs that by their very design don't really ever want you to actually be done. They want you to continue to play so they can potentially extract more cash via things like microtransactions, subscription fees, etc. And so while I don't exactly have anything against MMOs, there are still some that I enjoy or have cool content that I think is worth experiencing independently of the fact that it's a multiplayer game. Like for instance, ESO is an easy example there. They have a lot of fantastic Elder Scrolls lore in that game, and I love kind of interacting with that stuff, but unfortunately it's also surrounded by an MMO, which is the part I kind of don't want to do. I don't really want to have to gather up a group of people and manage everybody's complaints and schedules, etc. as we try to get through a dungeon or something just so I can see some content. That is just no longer something I want to do in basically any capacity, and as a result, MMOs tend to just sort of be kind of incompatible with the way I want to interact with games these days, and so I just kind of don't really play them anymore. Number 3 is a bit strange, perhaps going a little too broad, as it is basically just anything in VR, which is actually a shame, because I think the concept of VR is really cool. I don't have anything against VR games, really. In fact, I think a lot of them can have like interesting mechanics and approaches, but ultimately, as may not really be that much of a surprise given how VR has kind of failed to ever actually take off, and as it stands anyway, I don't really see too much of a future for that platform, but it comes down to a couple of things. And it's basically all of the physical discomfort playing anything in VR gives me. I have tried it a few times, but it's got a few major problems that I think are going to prevent it from, as I mentioned, ever kind of getting any bigger than it already is. First and foremost, you have to buy a bunch of hardware to actually use. That hardware is itself in addition to other hardware to actually run it, so it's already just an extra cost on top of what regular gaming is already going to cost you, but also that hardware that you are buying in order to play it is also just really uncomfortable. Basically, every VR headset is kind of like strapping a brick to the front of your face, and that's already kind of 2 big hurdles you have to jump over just to get somebody to play something in VR. And yet there is actually one more obstacle, as I myself have learned the painful way, which is I am incredibly prone to VR motion sickness. And that little problem, or honestly pretty big problem for me, is kind of a 3 strikes and you're out situation. So the last time I did anything with VR was relatively recently, a couple months ago. My son wanted to check out something that was like this VR experience, and I already knew it was going to be a problem given my prior experiences with VR have all been pretty much the same. And as expected, within just a few minutes of trying to do this thing, I was drenched in sweat from trying to force myself not to throw up everywhere. So while I actually really do think a lot of what VR is doing is really cool stuff, it is also, unfortunately, some of the most physically uncomfortable stuff imaginable for me in terms of playing video games. Now, what they tell you to do, if that is the case for you, or some kind of general advice, is basically just to play it in short bursts here and there to sort of get your body used to the sort of VR experience, which should, in theory, over time, sort of curb that reaction and motion sickness. And while that's probably sound advice, the thing is, I just don't fundamentally care enough about that experience to, go through everything I just mentioned. And it is just vastly more simple to say, you know what, this is not for me, and I'm fine with that, actually. Which brings us to number 4, and this is basically just any old sports game. Doesn't really matter the sport itself, but what may or may not surprise you, I guess, is there is actually some stuff I appreciate about sports games. In this day and age, a lot of these sports games have a sort of like sim aspect on the side of it, where you can manage a team or an individual player and their career throughout a sport, or various things that kind of simulate like a fantasy league at the same time. And I actually enjoy a lot of that stuff. I'm not like a huge sports guy by any means. I'll usually watch the big games of the year. In terms of American football, simply put, it may not seem like I'm the kind of guy who would play a lot of sports games in general, and while that is true to some degree, I still actually have enjoyed playing them in the past with, say, my brothers as an example. There is actually a pretty straightforward reason that I'm just not willing to play these at all anymore, and that is the microtransactions in sport games are just out of control. And that's before you even start talking about yearly releases that are just attempting to keep up with player rosters and stuff, and it just gets to be way too much, way too fast, and I don't care enough about sports to even attempt to keep up with that, let alone to pay for it. And I would say it's pretty quickly apparent anytime you try to play any sort of sports-related video game these days that it is all pretty much inherently pay to win, as people sift through content that is going to be made irrelevant by the time the next year's release rolls around anyway, because most of what every single one of these games tries to do is to extract as much cash as possible from the player as quickly as possible before next year's release makes it again irrelevant, which has had the unfortunate side effect of turning this sort of entire genre of video games into, honestly, just a pretty gross subsection of microtransactions that's pretty easy to avoid as a result, which is why I don't play them anymore. Which brings us to our final entry, which is in fact Sidescrollers. In all their wonderful iterations. Something about just, moving screen to screen, taking on various obstacles, boss fights of, I would say, varying difficulty depending on the side-scroller you're playing, were all the types of games that really enraptured me initially. Like some of the very first games I ever played were Sidescrollers, and while I think there's still a lot of really iconic games within that genre, and I also think games like, say, Hollow Knight prove there are still obviously big opportunities here for growth and to do interesting things. Unfortunately, none of those things are just anything I want out of video games anymore. Almost every experience I would like to have with a video game is really going to utilize things like 3D or just different camera angles, which are the types of things that are more likely to be engaging to me personally. And while honestly that's probably reason enough not to really play them anymore, it is honestly a little more complicated than that. As I have already alluded to, I did not have the best of childhoods growing up, and reality is this is kind of probably the most common type of video game I played back then, and so as a result, the genre has the unfortunate connection to times that I really don't want to find myself reminiscing about. And so for these games just not providing the experiences I'm really looking for on top of the associations that aren't really the game's fault in any way, it's easier for me to just not really play them, and as a result, whenever I see them, they don't really tend to grab my interest, and honestly, there's not exactly a ton of them being made these days anyway, so it's not exactly something that's difficult to just not play. So it's easier for me then to focus on the experiences that I would rather have, which is obviously all of the RPGs and everything that I cover. But I do think that's pretty much going to wrap it up for this particular video. Certainly hope you enjoyed it. With that in mind, I'd be very interested in hearing about any genres of video game you don't find yourself playing very often, or why you gravitated away from them for one reason or another, or, anything else you want to share, I suppose. Which naturally does in fact mean to like, comment, subscribe, all the YouTube jazz, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.